you get so big getting hold of this kind?
Hello, denizens of Port Haven. I'm here today interviewing Tom Huddleston, who has joined Star Wars through writing the Adventures in Wild Space series with Cabin Scott. He's also a man of many talents, writes for various magazines, does his own music. Some of his own work includes books like The Future King. He's also written about all sorts of films himself, and has interviewed an actor with a very similar name to his, which we will get to in a few minutes here. But we are very happy to have you here and joining us on Port Haven.
I'm very happy to be here.
All right, so getting started, as I said in my blurb there, you are a man of many hats. So how did you get started in writing, and what came first?
Well, I wrote fiction as a kid. I used to write stories, and I used to write tie-in novels for movies after I'd seen them, but I could only ever do the first couple of pages, because then by the time I'd got through the first couple of pages, I'd have forgotten what happened in the rest of the movie. But I've written for as long as I can remember. I started doing film criticism first just as a hobby, and then got a serious job and worked at Time Out for 9 years until last summer, when I made the transition into writing fiction full time. So I wrote the Star Wars books and my first book, The Waking World, aka The Future King Part 1, the long story, while I was still working at Time Out, and now I am finally a full-time author, which is very exciting.
That's fantastic. And what about music? How did you get into doing music?
It's just something I always wanted to do. I've always had a lot of friends who play music, a lot of friends in bands, a lot of friends making records, and about 10 years ago I just finally decided that it was time to start making music of my own, and met a bunch of people, and we formed a band called the No Sorrows, and we're still together. Last year we finally made a record. This is it. It doesn't have a title, it's just called the No Sorrows. You can buy it through my website if you want to. And it's on Spotify in the UK, but probably not in the US. But yeah, I mean, I just like to be as creative as possible. Working at Time Out was a great way to pay the bills, but it wasn't. Writing reviews isn't really that creative as a form of writing, in the same way that making music and writing fiction is for me.
And you've gotten to write about quite a few films, and you've gotten to do a lot of really cool interviews. Is there a particular piece you're the most proud of?
Non-interview pieces. The piece I'm most proud of is Time Out's 100 Best Horror Movies, for which we collated polls from hundreds of horror movie makers and critics and fans and scholars, and formed it into this giant list of the greatest horror movies of all time according to these people. And I wrote most of the copy, and it was just such a satisfying thing getting to get emails from people like Joe Dante and Alice Cooper and all kinds of really random people who submitted their lists of favorites. I mean, we did them on sci-fi as well, and romantic movies and animated movies, and they were all really good fun, but horror was the one that really came together, and I think the list was great. Interviews wise, I mean, in the first couple of years at Time Out, I was there for 9 years. In the first couple of years that I was there, I got to interview David Lynch, only on the phone, but that was an incredible experience, talking about The Elephant Man. I got to interview Neil Young. I got to interview Corey Feldman, who was a childhood hero of mine. And just, you know, it was incredible to be able to speak to all these people that I really, really admired. I interviewed Steven Spielberg once. That was pretty exciting. Never spoke to George Lucas. Did interview John Boyega for The Force Awakens, which was an absolute pleasure. He's such a lovely guy. So yeah, you know, I got to speak to a lot of. I spoke to Ben Burt one time in person. That was very cool indeed.
He's a Star Wars hero for sure.
He is an absolute legend.
I'd hinted at in my opening there. So I have a distinct memory after seeing Thor Ragnarok of a tweet you sent out saying that you also enjoyed the film, but not as much as all of the lovely ladies who were tweeting at you, telling you how good you were in it. So, which I was easily my favorite tweet of November. So you did get to interview Tom Hiddleston.
Yes.
What was that like, and how often do
I,
you get mistaken for the trickster god?
I have, well, I've met Tom on a couple of occasions. We were introduced at the San Sebastian Film Festival like years ago. I think he was there with, is it Unrelated, the Joanna Hogg film? He's just an incredibly lovely, easy to talk to, friendly, decent, all-round good guy. We have discussed the fact that our names are almost the same, and he has admitted that it was probably one of his ancestors. I mean, Huddleston is quite a long-standing British name. Hiddleston is quite weird, and I think he admitted that one of his ancestors probably just changed it because they felt like it, or were, you know, escaping debt or something along those lines back in the mists of time. Do I get mistaken for him? Never in person, as you can probably imagine, but on the internet a lot. Yes, it does happen a lot. The other thing that kind of makes it even more difficult is that there's a popular and fairly long-standing footballer in this country, or soccer player, called Tom Huddleston. He has an E on the end of his name, but obviously it's another set of issues. So I get loads of tweets telling me that Kong Skull Island sucked, or that I was really good in Thor, and I get loads of emails being quite abusive about my footballing skills. I don't follow football, and I don't do sport at all, so the jargon that they use is totally baffling to me. But people send these very involved and often quite angry tweets about my the goals that I've missed or whatever, and it's completely confusing to me. But I do think that I've also got quite a lot of followers on Twitter through the Tom Hiddleston connection, because people who like him tend to be quite kind of funny, interesting, open-minded people, and you know, the crossover between writing the kind of fiction that I write and people who watch the kind of movies that he's in is quite big. So I think I have actually got followers through having a name that sounds quite like this.
It's funny you mentioned the footballer also, because one of our reviews of one of I can't remember which of your Adventures in Wild Space book it was, but somebody left a comment like, wait, doesn't he play football? Like, why is he writing books? And I was like, oh, okay, I guess there's a lot of things. I didn't really know what he was talking about, but that's
yeah. That explains it. Yes, the footballer does have an E on the end, but yes, other than that, he is just Tom Hiddleston.
So when you sit down and you approach writing, say, a film critique or a song or a book, is there a different kind of writing process, a different kind of mental process?
Yeah, it's completely different. It's completely different in a way that's quite hard to explain. Writing film reviews is quite a technical process, so it's more about figuring out what you want to say, putting it in an order, and then saying it. Whereas writing fiction is obviously much more creative, and it's much more of an emotional process. And then writing songs is just, it's much more difficult than either of the other two, I personally find, and requires, I don't know, I tend to write songs very quickly, whereas the other two I'll take quite a lot of time over. I think with all three, there's certain things that that kind of go in parallel. Once you've got the first couple of lines, it's easier to start. The starting is always the most difficult bit. And certainly for writing reviews and writing fiction, I'm someone who plans everything in a very detailed way in advance of doing anything. So when writing a review, I will plan out where in the review I'm going to address certain points and then run through it in the same way as you might plan an essay for school, or for college. And for writing fiction, I tend to get all of the story beats down in advance, write really detailed chapter by chapter synopses, write character descriptions and biogs, and make sure I know absolutely everything that I can know about what I'm going to write before I actually sit down to write it.
So when you are writing your own stories, what kind of, is there particular themes you always like to get in there? Is there particular stories you do like to tell, or is it kind of case by case?
I don't think I'm at all alone or original in saying that I write the stories that I would want to read. And writing books for younger readers, I write partly the books that I want to read now, to be fair, but also the stories that I would have wanted to have read at that age, so a lot of action and drama and character conflict and weird locations and stuff that sparks the imagination is the kind of stuff that I write. I seem to have a slight obsession with dystopias. My first book, The Waking World, which was, and still one day may be, the first book in a series entitled Future King, was set in a kind of post-climate change England. I'm working on another novel at the moment which has a similarly futuristic dystopian themed. I think I think I like those ideas. I like stories where it's set in a world that you recognize, but things have changed so drastically that it's become somehow more magical and strange, and adventures can happen in a way that they can't necessarily happen in the real world.
So, speaking of magical and faraway places, were you a Star Wars fan before you started writing Star Wars?
Absolutely.
And how has that changed at all now that you've written for Star Wars?
Not in the slightest, no. I saw The Empire Strikes Back on my 5th birthday. I probably saw Star Wars quite soon afterwards on VHS. I have really clear memories of seeing all 3 of them for the first time. They've just, they've been with me for my entire life. I'm not remotely ashamed to say that I'm a bit of a geek about it. Not in a kind of, collecting figures kind of way, partly because I'm incredibly poor and that stuff doesn't come cheap. But yeah, it's just always been a world that I wanted to immerse myself in. I had the soundtrack albums as a kid. I saw the movies over, whenever I possibly could. Posters. It's just a universe that, it's part of who I am very much, and it always has been, and it probably always will be.
So how did you get involved with Star Wars, and how did Adventures in Wild Space get started?
Well, I'd written Star Wars bits and pieces for Time Out. I wrote a 50 Best Star Wars Characters piece, which is definitely online, which you can look up. So I'd kind of written, and I'd get interviewed by that point. I'm not sure, but I'd certainly written a lot about Star Wars for the website. But the editor that I'd worked with on The Waking World, or towards the end of the process of writing The Waking World, her then fiance, now husband, Emil, was the man who worked at Egmont and made Adventures in Wild Space happen. So she introduced me to him. He was looking for people to write Star Wars books for Egmont, and he already had Cav on board, and he was looking for someone to, for another writer, so that they could both write books in the series. And we had a meeting, and we got on immediately, and we liked the same stuff, and we thought a lot of the same things about Star Wars and stories and storytelling and what all of this stuff should be. So yeah, it went from there really. So it was just, knowing someone who was kind enough to put me in touch with someone else who needed a writer, essentially.
Now, with the Emil, would you happen to know, is that the fellow that the comic character of Emil Graff in Cavan's Tales was named after?
Yeah.
Okay. He was telling us that he was named after someone. I was trying to make the connection.
Yeah. So Emil was the editor at Egmont Books in the UK, who kind of put the whole Adventures in Wild Space thing together in the first place.
This is kind of an odd, detailed question, but I was just really curious. How did you and Cavan decide who got to write the first book and who got to write the last book?
We didn't. Emil and Lucasfilm, I think, together made those kinds of decisions. I think because Cav is by many, many leagues the more experienced writer, and particularly writer of franchise fiction. I mean, I'd have one book out, he's got, God only knows, 50 plus or something. He's worked on all these Doctor Who books, and he's really well versed in writing franchise fiction. So it was kind of inevitable that he would take the lead. So he wrote, I don't know if the World Book Day, the kind of short prequel book, was published in the US, but he wrote that, and then the first book, and then I picked it up with the second book. And then it just, because of the number of books we decided to do, it just worked out that I wrote the last one, which I was very happy about. I was really happy to be able to kind of bring it to a conclusion. It was a really nice thing to be able to do.
Obviously, the title kind of gives away a little bit of the story. In the rescue, but did you know how you wanted everything to end, and then it just kind of fell that way at that number? Or?
We had basic beats. I mean, we essentially knew where the story was going to conclude. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're on a mission to rescue their parents, so. Them finding their parents is obviously going to be something that happens towards the very end of the series. Everything else about pretty much everything else about the book was mine. So it was a quite interesting process throughout and I'm sure Cav would say the same, throughout writing the series. When we started with the first books that each of us wrote, definitely with me on the Nest, there was quite a detailed outline prepared for us. So we knew it was going to be a monster story, and that the kids were going to pick up a signal at the end, and the world had kind of been described a bit, and so there was kind of a template to write to. And then on my second book, The Dark, we kind of knew where it needed to fit, and I suggested the kind of slightly haunted house in space sort of idea for it, and then we planned it together from there. And then on the last book, we knew how it had to end, and I came up with pretty much all the rest of it. So it was like, as we got more confident as writers in that world, and as they got more confident trusting us to come up with good ideas, we were given more and more of the responsibility, which was a really lovely process, because it meant that every time you wrote a book, there was a bit more of you in it. So the rescue for me is very much it's the one that I feel most personally attached to.
When we had spoken to Kevin, he mentioned something about how he liked to try to catch you off guard with different cliffhangers of his books. What was your experience on getting stuck with that?
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, as I think he said in the interview, we wrote the book simultaneously. So, while he was writing the first book, I was writing the second. While he was writing the third, I was writing the fourth, and So, it's not like I read the book, got to the end, and went, "Oh no, what am I going to do?" It was more like I had a synopsis. So I was planning my book based on where I knew his was going to end. So the cliffhangers were never a terrible shock, but I do get the feeling that he enjoyed particularly the transition from the Steel, is it the Heist in the US?
Yes. Yeah.
Into the Dark / the Darkness US. I know he quite enjoyed leaving the kids in a situation where it seemed like everything was totally terrible. And then, of course, my immediate reaction was to take that and make it so much more terrible. Really put them in a completely dire situation. So that was really fun.
It was very enjoyable. I'd read the books at work, and I'm just sitting there like, I'm not getting really mad at this little book here while I'm trying to do my job. Speaking of the Nest and the Darkness, or the Dark, depending on which country you're reading it in, they felt like more tense installments than the others. It felt like you were putting kind of more basically scary kind of things in it, and you had animals in it, be it the tick bug things or the giant bug thing. I mean, you mentioned that you had kind of, the Nest was kind of given to you, but is that something where you wanted to put horror kind of into these books, or is that something that's kind of happened?
Definitely with The Dark, yes. With the nest, I mean, as you say, the outline was given to me. I mean, I love monster movies, so it was a very comfortable fit. It was funny. I've told this story a number of times, but when I wrote my first draft, the monster in it was really quite horrible. I mean, you know, there wasn't blood and guts or anything. I knew I was writing for kids, but it was pretty slimy and disgusting. And Emil, our editor, said, you know, try and tone it down a bit. Think Godzilla, not Cthulhu. Was his guidance. So yeah, obviously I had to kind of figure out the parameters of writing scary stories for kids. I mean, I loved scary stories when I was young, and The Dark was very much an attempt to tell, as I said, a haunted house sort of story, a scary story in space. One of the big inspirations for it was Nicholas Fisk's series Starstormers. I don't know if they ever even got published in the US. They're a great series, 5 books from kind of the mid-80s, I would guess, that I read when I was a kid. They're about a bunch of kids whose parents are working on a planet on the other side of the galaxy, and they're stuck on Earth in a boarding school, and they're really bored, and they decide to build a spaceship out of a hollow asteroid and blast off and find their parent. And in one of those books, they end up marooned on a kind of giant hulk of a space freighter that's completely abandoned and moving through space. It turns out to have all kinds of you know, creepy goings on happening on it. And that book really, you know, terrified me and set my imagination alight as a kid. And I wanted to do kind of a story about kids marooned in space and creepy stuff happening. As regards the kind of monster side of it, I mean, there is some kind of bug creature in all of the books, because Milo is really into his wildlife, as I was as a kid. And so, you know, it's kind of one of the things that Star Wars does best. So, you know, we want to put some element of creepy crawliness or, you know, giant monsterness in all of the books.
I particularly appreciated one shout out with those books, as they were attributed to a character by the name of Silo from the Darth Vader comics. Did you come up with the idea, and you know, Lucasfilm was like, hey, you can tie it this way? Are you familiar with the Darth Vader comics?
I have to admit that I'm not. So yes, that was something that was suggested. Yeah, I wanted to have creepy crawlies, and the energy spiders, I believe, had been in an old story which is now part of the Legends series, I guess. I don't know which one, but it was suggested to me as an idea. Here you go, energy spiders, and then the Silo thing kind of came on the back of that.
Okay. Yes, I've always found that interesting, just how the story group works with that kind of stuff. As a fan, I appreciate that there's someone out there connecting all the dots.
Yeah. No, as a writer, it's great as well, because you know, I know this world, but I know the world of the films much more than I know the expanded universe. It gives a greater depth to what you're writing, basically. You know, if people are able to tie strings together, and I mean, I watch Rebels obviously as well, so there's quite a lot of ties to that throughout the series. But yes, to kind of make those other more kind of tangential links is really nice.
Backtracking a little bit to what we were talking about with The Rescue, what was the process like, you know, writing a middle installment in a story versus, you know, writing the conclusion?
For one thing, The Rescue is slightly longer than all the other books. I came up with the story and I knew it wouldn't quite squeeze into the word count that we'd had for the other books. For one thing, there's an entirely new alien species in it that a sentient alien species that I invented. So, I mean, yes, I wanted to give it just a little bit more space and scope, really. I wanted it to feel like a kind of big, grand, climactic ending to the series. So it's got, you know, full-scale battles and a new planet, and as I said, a new species. So, you know, it feels, whereas, you know, the nest is essentially contained within a small forest area between the ship and the cave and back again, and the Dark is all entirely on one small ship. The Rescue is much bigger. Yeah. So yes, that sense of scale was something that I definitely wanted to have.
What would you say is the heart of the Adventures in Wild Space series?
Well, the kids, I mean, the relationship between them. Cav has two daughters. I have an older sister. It's kind of somewhere between those two. It's, he's looking at his own children and I'm thinking about my own childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have a niece and a nephew whose age gap is approximately the same. So it's all about kind of, we totally took inspiration from our own families and our own histories. And I think it's quite easy to write kids in books as a bit too nice and easy on each other and, always heroic and plucky and yay. And, and I think both of us agreed from fairly early on that they would bicker and that they would disagree and that they would do stupid stuff. I mean, in the dark, they make some really, really stupid decisions that result in them almost losing their lives. I mean, obviously, they recognize, the whole point is that they recognize that they've made bad decisions and they figure out together a way to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is really important. It's not just about having bad stuff thrown at them. It's about them making choices, having agency in the story and, making bad choices and then good choices to fix the bad choices. Yeah, I think that's the heart of it is the two of them.
Yeah, I have a little brother, so I've definitely enjoyed the sibling relationship through it. It rings very true.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite character to write in the series?
I mean, it's a toss up, really. Lena, definitely, probably she's my favorite character in book. It's just really nice to write a young girl who is really self-possessed and knows her own mind and is on a mission and wants to complete it. And as I said, makes mistakes and fixes them. But Crater obviously is really good fun to write as well, to make him, fussy and curmudgeonly. And it was really nice in the rescue, you'll see, but also in the cold a bit as well, Cav's second to last book. We actually tried to, there's a slight tradition with Star Wars droids that they basically stay the same throughout their adventures. They're there to provide comic relief. I mean, wonderful characters, but 3PO doesn't really have an arc as such. He's essentially the same guy at the end as he is at the beginning. Whereas Crater develops quite a lot. He's not exactly happy about being left in charge of these two kids.
Mm-hmm.
He's not the biggest fan of children. But there's moments in the rescue where, you have to read it, but there are moments where he has moments of kind of self-realization and realization of what his mission is and what his purpose is, and the way that purpose has changed across the adventures that they've had, and that was really nice to write, to kind of give him. And to give the kids a kind of a development, a character development, and an arc, and to see them learning.
Going forward, if you were given the opportunity, is there a particular Star Wars character or, say, time period you would just love to write?
I would, yes. Time period wise, I would really love to him write and or read more stories set in the immediate wake of Return of the Jedi, essentially. So that kind of I find that transition phase really fascinating, and I'm sure that the more stories are going to be told. And Chuck Wendig's Aftermath books are great characters to write for. There are just so many. I'd love to write Han Solo stuff. I know Cav's been doing that. I'm quite jealous. Princess Leia stuff would be great. I'd take any of them, really. Quite happily.
All right, well, that's it for my questions. It's been great talking to you. Great having this conversation, getting to know all of these things. We will have links to Tom's website and social media stuff in the description, so make sure you check that out. Also, make sure to follow us and visit us at port-haven.com. We are always excited to talk to everyone there. Tom, if you'd like to say a nice goodbye to all of our viewers.
Bye, everyone. I've got several books coming out in 2019, so not Star Wars ones, but yes, please, check them out.
So again, thanks for dropping by, and to all of you out there, keep it real and fly casual.